Hey guys, how's everybody doing? Thank you once again for joining me on another episode of the I Hate Football podcast. I am your host, your boy Q, and I had a question for everybody because it's still very puzzling to me. But is anybody else having any kind of trouble or difficulty wrapping your head around Bill Belichick, head coach of the UNC Tar Heels? Hope it's not just me. I'm definitely it's still really weird to me to hear Belichick referenced in that particular title. Definitely not anything that I ever expected to hear anytime in my lifetime. To be totally honest with you, but I think if we're being honest, sometimes I hate football, right? But let me tell you who is probably pretty happy about Bill Belichick, being the head coach at UNC, and I'm sure there's a lot of people connected to the UNC fan base, whether that be boosters or what have you. But let me tell you somebody who's got to be really happy about that, and I would say that's the commissioner of the ACC, and that would be Mr. Jim Phillips. And for those of you guys who are not super familiar with Jim Phillips, I would classify Jim Phillips as a guy who needed some positive news coming his way, coming the way of the conference for which he is a commissioner of. If you recall, the playoff scandal with Florida State a couple seasons ago, he was at the very head of that based on the way he handled and I guess didn't handle things, right? I think in the eyes of a lot of people out there, mainly the Florida State fan base and the administration. I think a lot of people felt like he didn't really adequately defend Florida State. When it came to their perceived snub out of the 14 playoff. Remember back then it was a 14 playoff, not the current 12-team format. But I think a lot of people kind of took some offense to the fact that he kind of hid when everything was said and done. Now that being said, who knows him piping up. I personally am not somebody who feels like that would have changed anything, right? I mean, there's no real power there when you talk about the commissioner piping up and saying this or that and this team should have been in, that team should have been in. At the end of the day, he wasn't part of the committee that made that decision. So, really, blaming him for Florida State, not getting in, I think is probably a little bit, just you're kind of wasting your time. But, again, somebody who I think, along, with the Florida State debacle, now you fast forward a little bit and not long after that, Clemson and Florida State, suing the conference in order to get out of the grant of rights agreements that the conference has, through ESPN, and then a little bit further along now, you really look at essentially he's kind of the figurehead, to the ACC essentially being behind when it comes to revenue compared to specifically the SEC and the Big Ten, due to the TV rights and the money coming from that and the lack of money compared to especially the SEC and the Big Ten. So, I think a lot of people, feel like the ACC is falling behind when you're looking at revenue, when you're looking at the ability to compete with the SEC and the Big Ten specifically, due to the fact that there's a very obvious discrepancy between the ACC teams and essentially the Big Two, as they're being called, due to the money, right? Because the ACC just isn't bringing in the money that those other conferences are bringing in, and you're seeing it really this year, right? You're seeing it, not to kind of get off topic, but you are seeing how the SEC now is kind of taking over as the dominant program, in the country when you talk about basketball, right? Where the ACC, they used to be kind of king of the hill when it came to basketball, right? Big Ten still, very good, but you saw and you continue to see what that influx of money is bringing into those conferences when you're talking about, employing the best coaches, being able to pay better players in the transfer portal, being able to pay better players coming out of high school. And there is a very direct correlation, with that money coming in from those TV deals. And it really is hard for the ACC to keep up with those other two conferences. So, going back to Jim Phillips and what he needed in terms of some positive news kind of coming his way, you got to figure he was ecstatic when he heard that Bill Belichick was going to be the head coach of UNC, right? I think as a conference getting away from the Jim Phillips aspect of it, I think you're looking at a conference who, really and truthfully, I think really did need an infusion of a few things, right? Needed an infusion of interest, right? And I think Bill Belichick immediately gives you that, right? Immediately gives you credibility. When you're talking about, at the head coaching position, a guy whose resume really is second to none, in terms of body of work and what it is he's done. There's nobody that's entered the college game, that has ever done what Bill Belichick has done, right? I mean, this is totally unprecedented, right? And you're looking at a guy who, again, immediately brings cachet, right, to the position. And now, again, going back to the, comparing conferences, right? You're looking at the SEC, who not only do they have the talent on the field, but they're the best because they have the talent, at the head coaching position, right? Even after losing, the greatest of all time and Nick Saban, you still have a guy like Kalen DeBoer who's won everywhere he's been, right? A little subpar this year, but you had to expect that, after taking over for the Nick Saban, right? I personally expected them to lose a few games, and I was right about that. And I think, again, not only did they lose Nick Saban, they clearly lost talent on the field that got drafted into the NFL and everything. So, again, when you're looking at comparing the conferences, definitely an infusion of cachet, of interest, of name recognition that I think is gonna do the conference really, really well. In my opinion, you're looking at the other teams in this conference, and again, what are we looking at in terms of name recognition, right? I mean, where's it at, right? You're looking at you obviously Dabo kind of leads the way, and I think for anybody who thought that Clemson was slipping or falling or whatever the case may be, I think this past season was a clear indication that Dabo knows exactly what he's doing. Right. I mean, let's call it what it is. Right. For anybody who was doubting Dabo for his view on the transfer portal and for his reluctance to go into the transfer portal and the whole deal, you can make of that whatever it is you want. Now, some people were speculating about Clemson's NIL funds availability and that kind of thing. That's not for me to decide. I don't pretend to know what it is that looks like over there in terms of NIL funds. But one thing you can't deny, right? One thing that is very evident, right, is that Dabo still is the king in the ACC, right? I think he's the most sustained success, right? A guy who's won 2 national titles here in the not too distant past. Right? I think it was 16 and 18, if I'm not mistaken. A guy who is developing players at a ridiculous level. He hits on his recruiting classes are always top notch, and he fell off a little bit this past year, but still developing guys, putting guys in the NFL, winning the conference, just like he did this past year, who maybe, again, wasn't necessarily expected to, still won the conference, still made it, the playoff, right? So you're looking at, he leads, without a doubt. And then after that, I think, you can make a case for a couple guys, right? I think, when you're talking about a national brand, I think you still have to go with Miami, right? I think for whatever you do or don't think of Mario Cristobal's ability to coach, and I think the not taking the knee, a couple seasons ago, obviously still is something that people are going to reference and the whole deal. No matter what, I think the guy still leads a national program, a program that definitely carries weight on a national level, and I think I could make the argument that even though they haven't been the most successful in the field, I think they're probably still the biggest national brand for several reasons, right? And I think their history, being the biggest reason for that, but I think it's a program that Mario is building. I think the recruiting is building towards something really big in 26. obviously look no further than having, more than likely the first pick in the draft in Cam Ward. And I think, you can reasonably say that, the University of Miami is probably the number 2 program in the ACC on several levels, right? You have, a program like SMU, right? Makes the college football playoff in their second year in a Power Four. A guy in Rhett Lashley who is doing well, but a guy in Rhett Lashley who isn't a national name, right? They're starting to recruit well. I think they're starting to get NIL, more available to them in the whole deal. But I don't think a guy who when you're talking about name recognition, a guy who moves the needle outside of your big college football fans and obviously recruits and everything like that, but not doesn't move the needle in terms of name recognition in my personal opinion. You figured that Mike Norvell at Florida State was going to continue that trajectory, based on what they did a couple seasons ago, going undefeated in the regular season. But big time fall off from that program this year. I don't know that anybody expected that, right? Going 2-10 and just looking inept, on every level, right? On all 3 sides of the ball, inept coaching, just lack of talent. And so I think that hurt the conference when you're talking about, the power in the perceived power in the conference and having that, kind of translate year to year. I think that definitely hurt, the conference is having one of the marquee names and a national brand, without a doubt, just fall, flat on their face essentially, right? After having such a good season, the year before. So again, all in all, you're looking at, a guy like Bill Belichick in this conference, right? And again, I think immediately he elevates the quality of the coaching in the conference for again, for very obvious reasons, right? On several levels. So, again, I think if you're Jim Phillips, right, you have to look at that. I think you have to be really, really excited, when you're looking at the prospects and what it is that he brings to the table. I would imagine ACC Media Days, which are taking place in Charlotte, no less, July 22nd through the 24th. I would imagine that, the lack of coverage, I think is probably going to even out a little bit, come ACC Media Days. I would imagine there's probably not going to be, a guy getting, more coverage than Bill Belichick, again, for several reasons, not the least of which ACC Media Days taking place in Charlotte and the guy being, who he is, right? The guy is arguably the best coach of all time. He's definitely in the conversation when you consider, Vince Lombardi and Andy Reid and, when you're talking about Nick Saban in college and Bear Bryant and all those kinds of people, he's squarely in that conversation, no matter what it is you thought of, his last, couple seasons without Brady. You can't deny the resume. The resume is what it is. 6 Super Bowls, so on and so forth, a couple more as an assistant, with the Giants. And so, listen, the guy is, one of the greats without a doubt. So again, can only help the conference, and Commissioner Phillips, I would imagine, is ecstatic to have a little bit of that good press coming to the conference, as opposed to some of the negative press that I think we can all agree he's kind of helped drum up for the conference also. But I think now you're looking at it now on a more personal level when you're talking about, the coach himself, right? You're looking at, a coach who has to look at this landscape, of college football and wonder, well, why can't I come in and immediately contend, right? You're looking at, you're looking at a guy who has to be coming in even at his age, and I think 74, 75, if I'm not mistaken. And you have to look at that guy and you have to have a definitely a pretty large chip on your shoulder, even given your history. Because I think when you're looking at, what the NFL essentially told you within the last couple seasons is that you're essentially obsolete, no matter what you've done, right? Nobody was really looking to hire you, right? I think if the reports are out there and if you're looking at everything that you see online, you're talking about one confirmed interview, right? And I think those were the Falcons, but one confirmed interview, even though I'm sure he had, talks, unofficial talks, through his agent and all that kind of thing. But officially, one interview reported and no offers, right? And I, for sure, I was kind of surprised at that, because when you're looking at some of the people who landed jobs, right? And I'm, not trying to, throw shade anybody's way, but I would definitely consider, some of these hires that were made. I would have considered Bill Belichick before, 3 or 4 of these hires that were made fairly recently. So, again, that's for each, front office to decide. And who knows what was going on behind the scenes, whether he was demanding more control and and a bigger voice in personnel, which those rumors are out there, and everything like that. So, again, whatever caused that to be the case and him not have a head coaching gig, still really surprising to me that he, because again, I can't imagine there's 32 head coaches that are better right now than Bill Belichick, no matter what his recent history has been. So, again, I think if you're him, you have to come into this position with a huge chip on your shoulder, and really eager to prove that, listen, I'm still that guy, right? Let's not forget what I've done. And I think he's got to feel disrespected, right? I mean, I know I would, for sure, without a doubt, I would feel disrespected. So, again, what he's walking into, I think that remains to be seen, right? But again, you compare it, kind of going back to, I hate to go back to continue to go back to the SEC, but how crazy, do I think the coverage would be if he would have landed? I don't know. Pick a program, right? You're looking at a program in the SEC. Pick one. Missouri. Ole Miss, Mississippi State. I mean, I would imagine that the coverage, for a guy like Bill Belichick in the SEC or in the Big Ten, let's say, I think would have just been, just nonstop. I think there'd be the Big Ten through Fox Sports, or the SEC through ESPN. I feel like they'd be capitalizing on that, to be totally honest with you. And so I just again, I don't know if I'd call it an indictment on the ACC and Jim Phillips for the way they kind of the lack of coverage that this thing has had, but I don't. It's almost disrespectful, to me, to see the lack of coverage that this thing has received. And I think it just kind of speaks to, what the national, what the national opinion is, right? When you're talking about Bill Belichick. And I really think people just assume that, he's done, that he's washed, and that he's just not going to be a factor in, in this particular, gig at UNC with the Tar Heels. So it just really is like, it's a little bit surprising to me that there's been a lack of coverage, such a lack of coverage, but again, I think we'll see. I think once media days, come around, I think you'll see that. But honestly, I feel like with the Big Ten and the SEC, I really feel like they would have capitalized more on that, on this particular hire, and take advantage of what this hire could bring in terms of eyeballs on the conference, and and everything of the sort. So again, you really when you're looking at some of the stuff that the kind of the trajectory of him being a free agent, right? It's been really odd, right? You're looking at all of a sudden now, he's dating like a 24-year-old. He's doing yoga on the beach and with her and the whole deal. And so, there's, I think, in an attempt, to be, and I think you have to, right? It's a very necessary attempt to connect with a much younger demographic that he's going to deal with when you're talking about the recruiting in college and the whole deal, especially, recruiting in high school, where, you're meeting some of these kids, you're not meeting them for the first time, when they're 18 years old, right? I mean, you have to start, these classes are being worked on, the 26 classes in that class is the next class up. And, you're talking about having to work on kids for the 28 class, right? And that makes these kids, some of these kids are 15 years old, right? And so, is that something he's going to be able to do, right? When you're looking at the staff he's putting together, these guys are calling themselves the 33rd NFL team. A little cringy, if I'm being honest. I think it's a little weird. And if I saw something, a little while ago, and his general manager, which is a guy named Michael Lombardi, very, very successful a guy who's, has been on the NFL Network and for a long time and the whole deal. A guy who really knows the game. You listen to him talk, very intelligent. A guy who knows how to evaluate talent and who's been in NFL front offices and everything. What he says and the way he describes it is everything we do here is predicated on building a pro team. And so we consider ourselves a 33rd NFL team because everybody who's involved in our program has had some form or aspect in pro football, right? Take that for what it's worth. I don't know how well that's going to work. I think it's, again, I think it's a reach, to be totally honest with you, but again, that kind of tells you what it is that they're trying to build, right? Everybody that they're bringing in some form of NFL, some form of NFL connection, right? Which can't hurt. It's got, guys that scout and with a scouting background and developing talent and the whole deal can only help you, right? But where, if you're bringing in only guys from the NFL, what kind of analysts are you bringing in? What kind of grad assistants are you bringing in? How are you connecting with these guys who are 14, 15 years old, when you start recruiting them? I think that's kind of where I'm looking at a guy like Bill Belichick and I wonder, okay, is he going to be able to relate? Right? Is he going to be able to walk into homes? I'm sure the parents are going to be okay with it, of these 14, 15-year-olds, but are you going to be able to connect with these kids who not only are you recruiting starting at 14, 15, 16 years old, but now having to convince the parents and the child that you're going to be around when they get to college, right? I mean, are they wasting their time, taking official visits to UNC under your staff? Because, let's be honest, you're not getting any younger. Right. And I would have to imagine that at some point in the very near future, the NFL will come calling again. And, I don't think it would be a surprise to anybody, for him to end up back in the NFL. Right. But yeah, on a very personal level, you have to look at this thing and say, hey, listen, this thing is ripe for the picking. Right. And I would have to think that he looks at the coaches in college and would have to imagine they're inferior to him. Right, for several reasons, right, and look no further, than a guy named Stuart Mandel, who's a really good columnist. He writes for The Athletic, and on March 11th, Stuart Mandel put out an article, and it's titled "Power Ranking College Football's Top 25 Coaches in 2025." So for the upcoming season, Stuart Mandel for The Athletic put a list together of, in his opinion, what the top 25 coaches, who the top 25 coaches are for the upcoming season, right? And for him, the way that he the aspects and what it is he's considering are things like, so he says these are not career achievement rankings. He says I heavily weigh the past 3 to 5 seasons this year to align with somebody else's article. And he says he's following the requirement that a coach must have 3 seasons of head coaching experience, right? So those are your parameters in terms of who Stuart Mandel thinks are, and this is one man's opinion, right? There's a lot of people out there who are going to have very differing opinions for very different reasons. It's just one that kind of caught my eye based on the names that were involved in the article. I was really intrigued by the article, and if you get a chance, you subscribe to the Athletic. They put out a lot of good stuff. But number one, to nobody's surprise, Kirby Smart, right? And then you go down the list, and I think there's a lot of names that I think people would expect, right? When you're looking at Kirby Smart, number 2 is Ryan Day, 3 Steve Sarkisian, number 4 is Kalen DeBoer. A little bit surprised about that one. Dan Lanning at number 5, Dabo at number 6. And then you get to where I thought was a first surprise, and a guy like Lance Leopold, right? Who's maybe a lot of people haven't heard of. He's the head coach at Kansas, right? A little bit surprised by that one. He was number 2 last year, according to Stuart Mandel. Again, very surprising. But they went from 9-4 to 5-7 last season. And even though he did really well at Kansas to turn that program around, I think having Lance Leopold at 7 is a little bit rich, in my opinion. But it really just, again, highlights, one, what the ACC has, right? And it's ACC talk. So kind of, what I wanted to focus on. And the ACC, based on what I wrote down, has 3 coaches in Stuart Mandel's top 25. 3 coaches, and so when you compare those to, again, the big two, when you're talking about, the SEC had 6 of the top 15 coaches according to him, right? Then you have the Big Ten had 6, the ACC had 3, the Big 12 has 6. It's a little bit surprising in my personal opinion. The American Athletic Conference had 2, Conference USA had 1, and the one independent, which is Marcus Freeman, clearly one of the top 25 coaches in the league, or in the country. I'm sorry. So really interesting names on here. Guys like Matt Campbell at number 9. We have Marcus Freeman at 10. Kurt Cignetti, who's the head coach at Indiana, at 11. And again, so on and so forth. Brian Kelly, Lane Kiffin, a guy like Kyle Whittingham, who I think a lot of people agree is a really good coach. He was number 5 according to Mandel last season, and so on and so forth. Then you have a guy like Jamie Chadwell, who's a head coach at Liberty, formerly at Coastal Carolina. He's at 17. Chris Kleiman at Kansas State at 18. Jeff Brom at 19 from the ACC. Jeff Munkin from Army at 20. You got Kalani Sataki from BYU at 21. At Red Lashley at 22. So on and so forth. So it's a John Summerall from Tulane at 25. So it was an interesting article in my opinion. I think some guys maybe being given some credit for some stuff from the previous seasons that I don't know that necessarily makes them a top 25 coach now. But I say all that to say, if you're a guy like Bill Belichick and you're looking at this list, at this particular list, for example, right? And you're looking at overall in the grand scheme of college football, you don't even take the 133 teams that play, FBS football. You're looking at your big 4 conferences, right? And I think in my personal opinion, I've always thought there's, right this minute, I would say there's about 5 to 6 elite head coaches. Right, you're looking at there's only a few active coaches that have actually won titles. Ryan Day is not one of them. Right, you're looking at Dabo Sweeney. You're looking at Kirby Smart, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, those are the only 3 active coaches that have won titles. Right, and so to me, you're looking at a tier system in which I would probably put anywhere from 5 to 7 head coaches as elite. I think your second tier of coaches, and I won't get into all of them, but I think, I would probably put, somewhere in that second tier, I would probably put, anywhere, around a dozen coaches, say 12 to 15. Right. And I think after that is just a huge group of guys who are just okay. A lot of them are retreads. A lot of them, you're kind of hot, coordinators that really don't end up living up to the hype. But again, I think if I'm Bill Belichick, right, and I get the offer to come coach at UNC, and I'm looking at, okay, who's my competition? I'm looking at 7 to 10 guys out of 133, 134, right? That are really, guys who are considered really good to elite coaches, right? And 3 active coaches who have won national titles. So, again, if you're him, why not? If you're him, why not say yes? If you're him, why not try and show everybody that, that you can still do it, making really good money. Now the issue will be, what does UNC do, with NIL? What does UNC, are they going to be able to, like I mentioned, are they going to be able to recruit with, your Dabo Sweeneys and your Mario Cristobal's and so on and so forth, right? Are you going to be able to go in these living rooms and build rapport with young people, build a connection, and have them trust you enough to say yes to your program? Given the fact that not very many people think you're going to be around for a long time and actually see these commitments through, right? And so you're looking at how what's going to be your approach in the transfer portal, which and in my opinion, I feel like that's probably more immediately where you're going to see a little bit more of the effect of a guy like Bill Belichick, right? Going into the portal and the immediate future of some of these guys who maybe have already been in school for 4 or 5 years, right? And have immediate plans to, spend one season, in college and then, kind of go to the NFL. These guys are promising you being the 33rd team, promising you an NFL developmental experience to prepare you to go into the NFL. So Listen, I don't know how to call this, to be totally honest with you. I was skeptical when it first kind of hit the airwaves. When people started, reporting it and running with it. And, once it became official, you look at what the buyout entails. And I think after this upcoming season, I think his buyout is like $1 million. So, again, I think it's a situation that makes it really easy to negatively recruit against him. If I'm another program, you can easily say, hey, listen, this guy's not going to be there. Buyout's $1 million. All right, this guy's an NFL guy through and through. He's not going to be around for you, long term. Again, I think it kind of negatively recruits itself. And I, for one, am very much on the fence to see how this thing is going to go. But without a doubt, I think it's going to be very entertaining. I think Bill Belichick, again, going back to his view on coaches and what it is he knows about himself and what it is he's done. I think this is a guy who, again, when you start looking at some of these teams being, very, very close in terms of talent and that parity kind of being involved. I think this is a guy who, just like a coach can cost you a game, a great quarterback, a guy like Cam Ward, can account for 1 or 2 wins. I think when you're talking about parity and a guy who is going to win in the margins, like I think Bill Belichick will, this is a guy who, who can get you, two more wins than maybe, you thought you were going to get when you're talking about, coaching and tactics and everything like that. I think is a guy who could easily add, two wins to your total. So, again, I think it's a really interesting move by UNC. I think it's a move by, a program who, really has nothing to lose. A program who I think by and large, is behind several programs in the ACC. You're looking at, who knows at this point, no better than on a national level, interest and everything like that. What are we looking at? The bottom half of the conference when you're looking at, a program like UNC. So again, I think it's a big swing. And I think it's low risk and I think it's high reward, if you're UNC. And I think if you're Bill Belichick, I think you have to look at this thing and the landscape of college football and the coaches who you're going against and feel like this thing's, right for you to come in and be able to turn things around, between the transfer portal and NIL and your background as a Super Bowl winning coach. I think you got to look at this thing and like where you stand. If you're Bill Belichick, I don't think that you could tell him any different. So, let's see where it goes, guys. I think I'm just like you. I'm just ready for the next for the next step in the off season. To come and go and let's get to Labor Day weekend as fast as we possibly can. But in the meantime, we'll have plenty of stuff to talk about. I'll be back with you guys here sometime in the next few days with my buddy Will from the 305 Sports Now podcast. We'll be doing something, I think, Thursday night. So we'll have that for you here in a few days. But until that time, guys, I definitely appreciate it. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks so much for tuning in. Do me a huge favor. Please like the video, subscribe, help me get these numbers up, help me get this thing rolling. And we'll talk to you really, really soon. All right, guys, have a great night. Talk to you soon.